can't progress in. Oh my God. So despite I need to be very quick now, I will try to organize my my presentation in 3 parts. As an introduction, I will recall quickly the main point we have to keep in mind about the Tylos phase of the Bahrain archaeology and ancient history. After, I will have my development about the work we are conducting in Abu Saiba since 2017, and the main result we have achieved up to now will constitute the main part of my talk, because before some work of conclusion and thought for the future of our research there. So about Tylos, as I recall, the ancient historical text remind us that around 325 BC, the main islands of Bahrain were approached by a maritime expedition led by Androsthenes of Thasos, one of the admirals of Alexander the Great. This expedition actually led to a very precise environmental description of the island, and an account which is unfortunately lost today. Number of historical facts, I think nevertheless, are well established. This is on this occasion of this expedition, for example, that the name Tylos was given to Bahrain, and the name Arados to the neighboring and smaller island of Muharraq. These 2 associated toponyms will in fact appear for generations on maritime maps. If the original version of Androsthenes' report disappeared, it has been regularly quoted, luckily, by the historians and naturalists of the classical antiquity, mainly by Theophrastus in his History of Plants, and by Pliny the Elder in his Natural History, but also by the historians Strabo or Arians, for example. The description provided there in their work is quite impressive, and it's a vivid description of Bahrain and its landscape. It describes notably the luxuriant gardens of the island, its numerous freshwater springs. It also mentions a lot of details about trees, fruits, including date palm, vine, fig trees, etc. A special description also concerns the mangrove on the coast side, mentions the text. There is such a number of trees that when the tides goes out, they make a regular fence. This is unfortunately, no more the case in Bahrain now, except in the small sector of Tubli Bay, where a little portion of mangrove is still visible. They also mention the cultivation of cotton, which is quite interesting. Under this curious appellation, they speak about cotton, speaking about the trees bearing wool. And of course, I will not forget the recurrent mention concerning the Tylos pearls, particularly abundant, if we know, of premium quality in the Bahrain seabeds, and was probably a major export of Tylos, as it was also the case in the former Dinul period. In other words, from that period, Bahrain, the former center of the Bronze Age Jimmun culture, clearly entered the Eastern Hellenistic world about 2,000 years after the Dinul time. The Bahrain island will then experience an exceptional long phase of prosperity, first under the tutelage of the Seleucid Empire in the 3rd and 2nd century BCE, and then from the 2nd century BCE under the control of the kingdom of Kharasen, south of present Iraq, as definitely confirmed about 20 years ago by the discovery in Shakura of fantastic dedicatory inscription in Greek, which has been reused as a covering capstone for a Tylos grave at Shakura. And this quite interesting text, made by a certain Kephisodoros, governor of Tylos, is a clear confirmation of the thought of the many historians of all historians for several years. The text says exactly, in the name of King Dispausines and of Queen Thalassia, me, Kephisodoros, strategos of Tylos and the islands, had dedicated the temple to the Dioscuri saviors in ex voto. In other words, he placed this inscription in the temple dedicated to Castor and Pollux, the famous Dioscuros kings, in order for a safe return of his king Dispausines, who probably visited Bahrain at that time. It was a fantastic discovery because it confirmed all the previously thought of historians. Still about Tylos, a particular aspect of the archaeology of Tylos phase in Bahrain is that it's mostly known through the cemeteries only. Only one dwelling settlement is known and constitutes one of the later levels of the tale of Kalat al-Bahrain, the former capital of Dilmun. The reason for such situation, I'm sure, is that the human geography was more or less fixed precisely during the Tylos phase, and that most of the settlement clusters situated along the traditional historical village of northern Bahrain, they are situated precisely below this traditional village of northern Bahrain, Barbar, Diraz, Jansan, Karana, Al-Ajar, Al-Maksha. Such a situation, of course, renders their exploration quite difficult at modern period. So Tylos is mostly known through the cemeteries. Alors, the Tylos necropolises definitely appear in the landscape of Bahrain in a different way than the famous Dilmun burial mounds. They usually appear, as you can see here, under the aspect of quite large low mounds. They can reach 5 meters in height in average, and which gather under them a large number of graves. This is a main difference from the cluster of separated individual burial mounds from the Dilmun period. The image you have there were taken at the excavation time of one of the Tylos cemeteries of Sar by the German expedition in 1993. And this image clearly explains the constitution of a Tylos cemetery. Usually, at the heart of the necropolis, there is a more or less elaborate grave over which an imposing mass of sand has accumulated, probably to make it visible from a distance. We used to call it, as archaeologists, the foundation grave. Later, the following tomb of the cemetery formed progressive concentric circles around it, with their own sandy mount above them, which in turn, these sandy mounts progressively merge to form the characteristic low hillock that marks the shape of a traditional Tylos necropolis. Some other images from other Tylos necropolises. One at Shakura is a central foundation grave, another large Tylos cemetery at Shakura. This is more or less what we can expect at the end of our excavation in Abu Saiba. Let's now turn to Abu Saiba. You have to know that there is a special concentration of Tylos cemetery in the northern part of Bahrain, notably in the sector situated at the south of the present Budaya highway between Makaba and Al-Ajar, including Abu Saiba and Shakura. You see all these green dots are cemeteries which were still existing in 1986, the time of this topography. Of a lot of them has been excavated, a lot of them unfortunately disappeared, but there's still a lot of them still remaining today in this area. So this is the position of Abu Saiba, Mound 1. So let's now turn to this Mound 1. In 2017, a strong threat appears on one of the large and unexcavated Tylos necropolis at the site of Abu Saiba, situated in the northern part, so Bahrain Island, at about 8 kilometers at the west of Manama. And the direction of archaeology of Bahrain at that time proposed notably this site to the French team for a rescue excavation to be started as soon as possible. So this is some more images of animated images from our present site of Chakra after some time of excavation. You can notably see that the present site is almost enclosed within the modern urbanization of this northern part of Bahrain, especially the village of Abu Saiba here. Thanks to a very good cooperation established between our French team and the Japanese teams of the Nara Institute Archaeology, who is working in Bahrain now and was present in Bahrain shortly before the work of our second expedition campaign in 2018. A photographic cover by drone was made, and the photographic treatment of this image was realized later by Dr. Nobuya Watanabe from Chubu in Japan, which has allowed a very good topographic plan, very precise one, and I really thank my Japanese colleague for that. So we have also to know that in '93, there was some previous research at the site. The site was very different at that time. It was in a quite isolated part of Bahrain, not with a modern urbanization. And it has been excavated in 1983 on its southwest and southeast flanks by a Bahraini team. And this work was dictated by, at that time, constraint of roads and construction of wood dwellings in this sector. It has been then registered under the name of Mound 1 of Abu Saiba, toponym which was at that time transcribed in the form Busaib. And you can see notably where this excavation, which excavated about 40 graves, if I well remember, was at that time. They found quite a lot of material, which is presently displayed in the very small, at the moment, Tylos Hall at the Bahrain National Museum. It included a lot of infixatory objects, golden objects, gravestones, stelae, figurative stelae, glasses, etc. So 1983, and we start again in 2017. Alors, some now main features of this Abu Saiba 1 necropolis. At first, you can notice a very important and very heavy density of this necropolis. Graves are very close together. Some are built above other one, and that explain what it's quite low process of excavation at that site. You have here a plan, a general ground plan of the site, which is this is a provisional stage after our last season. First, this density. Second, we have a lot of different kind of graves. Some graves, globally, we can say that the built graves exposed at Abu Saiba appear remarkable by their regularity and care taken in their construction. All tombs usually consist of a rectangular burial chamber, probably built after digging a pit and reinforced by a wall of perfect verticality consisting of stone, of small modules related to the mortar. The coating, visibly made of lime, sand, and ashes, which is very close to what is used in the traditional Bahraini architecture, was then carefully applied to the entire wall of these chambers, as well as generally on its perfectly horizontal floor. It is noted also, you can see on this image, that the coating also covers the top of the wall of the chamber, thus delimiting a flat edge generally varying between 20 to 30 centimeters wide. Sometimes more in the case of the more imposing tomb. And this flat frame, of course, contribute visibly to receive and support the covering stone slabs. That are the most beautiful graves, but we have also much more grave, very simple, of different size, as you can see here. The cover of the grave usually consists of flat slabs, 3, 2, 4, it depends, extracted from the local bedrock, easily accessible in this sector north of the island. These capstones usually are carefully sealed between them with addition of smaller stones, in their interstices. Alors, some of these capstones can be huge. We have here the case of grave 30, which is one of the largest capstone that we discover at this necropolis. You can see the dimension, more than 3 meters in length, and notably, it is very thick, about half a meter in thickness. It's a huge block, and we were not able to remove the largest capstone to excavate this grave, for example. As we are speaking about capstone, it's a moment also to mention the existence of a recurrent ritual that we observe anytime we are excavating there. Visibly, after the placing of the capstone and their sealing, there was a traditional burial rite performed at the grave, which consists of burning some ashes and maybe other material in a bowl, and this bowl was put after upside down at the top of the capstone. And we have a lot of this bowl found or still in situ in place on this capstone or very close to the capstone, as the looting that we will speak about on this site has perturbated a lot of things. On these capstones, usually, we have mounds, sandy mounds, which are placed at the top of this capstone. So at the beginning of our excavation, it was important to keep some vertical section in order, if I can say, to read the stratigraphy. This section, in some areas, would make possible to identify the sandy mounds that I was talking about, surmounting the built tomb, which was, that, by the way, previously recognized in the other Tylos cemeteries. But we noticed a specific architectural feature at Abu Saiba, and that is very, very important. Several of these mounds were covered with a kind of stone pavement, ostensibly to maintain their filling, of course, but I think very important too, to mark them in the original necropolis landscape, most likely to signal the high status of their occupant. We can compare, for example, with some modern Shia cemeteries in Bahrain, where you have some graves for saints and for very important people, and where at the top of it is built a special monument. So it's the same signification with this stone paved mound. Very often they have not preserved up to the top of the mounds, probably most likely because of the erosion of the site. What we have to remember, it's that this practice, which has been already observed in other sites in Bahrain, other necropolis, the Tylos period in Bahrain, reach a very important and totally unusual frequency in Abu Saiba. Over the entire area we have excavated up to now, it is not less than 11 stone mounds that have been identified, which can reach up to 6 meters in diameter for the largest. Until now, none was found preserved until its summit, as I told you, but this big concentration for the night, it's absolutely unique in Bahrain. So very probably this indicates probably high status for this necropolis of Shakura, where probably quite important people were buried. You have some images of former Tylos cemeteries excavated in Bahrain, for example, in Karana or in Shakura, and you can see that usually in this necropolis, we have only 1, 2 mounds, 3 mounds sometimes in the whole necropolis, which are covered. with stone pavement. And in Abu Saiba, on just a quarter of the wool cemetery we have excavated up to now, we have already 11 now. This is huge. Regarding now the bone remains we find, we have to remember that we have a very important looting which exists at the Tylos cemeteries, which probably occurred during the early antiquity, soon after the end of the Tylos period. A lot of these graves were looted, heavily looted sometimes, but it's not systematic. Some graves have totally escaped this looting, and we can still find bones, complete skeleton, or associated material. Sometimes we have nothing. And you can see that also the preservation of this bone material can vary from complete skeleton, quite well preserved, to very badly preserved skeleton. This one was almost, for his upper part, a ghost. We have just a trace of the skeleton, but not really. It was just bone powder. In other case, we have completely disturbed grave by the looting. And sometimes, even outside the grave, we have pile of bones probably related to the looting. These skeletons were very often, is it systematic? Is it just associated with rich people? Were deposited in wooden coffins. These wooden coffins, we have the example of Shakura, where two fantastic wooden coffins have been found in the 90s, at the end of the 90s. But in Shakura, we have traces of this coffin. In many graves, we can still find trace of wood, trace of dark marks in the shape of a rectangle, which are clearly marked of ancient coffins, wooden coffins. You have here the dimension of one of the last we found. So, regarding the chronology of this necropolis, of course, we are waiting, of course, C14 dates, radiocarbon dates. Now, for the moment, they are in process, they're under treatment. I didn't yet receive the results, but we have tried to organize a sampling, organize around a radius starting from the outside of the necropolis to the center of the necropolis. Remember, you can remember what I explained you previously, the famous foundation grave. And of course, all the additional grave has been built at a later time around this foundation grave. And the total existence of such a Tylos necropolis could have reached several centuries. We have definitely in Bahrain Tylos necropolis, which were in use for at least 2 centuries minimum. So it will be very important to have different kind of radiocarbon date organized along such a radius. For the moment, the only way to provide a datation is a pottery. When the graves are not looted, we find some pottery. I will not develop this point too much. You have here the major shapes we have found up to now, not all of them, just some of them. I will not detail, but according to comparison made with other sites in Bahrain, outside Bahrain, notably a lot of connection with the site of Ed-Dur in the Emirates, which is exactly from the first century of our era, first century CE. So we have a lot of comparison. So for the moment, I would be very surprised if our next radiocarbon date will not come date of end of first century, beginning of first century CE. So to summarize, for the moment, we have the following data. We found, including the last campaign, we were able, fortunately, to work in Bahrain last spring, even during the COVID period. We were the only foreign team working in Bahrain at that time. We have now 70 located graves. 39 were excavated and found with bone material. analyzed by our bioarchaeologists, specialists. We have found 11 totally empty graves. We excavated them, but there was absolutely nothing inside. And we have still 20 graves which has been located but not excavated. I already spoke about the 11 stone paved mound, and we have recovered about 300 artifacts since 2017. Now, I would like, before finishing, just to present a few specific burial cases we found in this necropolis, which will provide you more information about the work we are doing. At first, in many I have a problem of, well, sorry, what happened? It was supposed to, well, anyway, I came back to the former image. It was a picture showing the bones of different fragmented bones of a skull with a little coin placed near the jaw, which is a noble silver ruble. And it was a tradition during the Tylos period, that in a common practice in Abu Saiba, to place a noble, which is the smallest Greek currency unit, which is inspired by the Alexandrian types used in the pre-Islamic Arab coins from the 1st century BC in the 1st century CE, which is another clue for chronology. And it's a practice, an ancient practice of a Greek world, which is called something, the offering to Charon, which is a ferryman to the netherworld. And people receive this little piece in their mouths to pay the ferryman to pass the river to the other world. You have always to remember that all the burial practice of Tylos turn around this notion of a journey to the afterlife, providing food in vessels, in pottery vessels for the deceased, providing liquid to the deceased for this, and certainly a little coin. But curiously, it's not a systematic practice for unknown reason. So I hope that the rest will work. Yes. This is another case I wanted to discuss, a precise case of grave, which is quite interesting, grave 39. We find the grave apparently well preserved, untouched by plundering, with three big capstones, and with a lot of little capstones placed inside for a careful sealing. But when we examine very carefully from close all these little stones, we discovered that they were not normal stone. They were this sealing was deliberately composed of small weights of maybe fishing net, but more probably loom scales for weaving. These loom scales were either perforated fine flint pebbles, of irregular shapes, or artifacts of more regular and literalization, worked in the fine-grained limestone of Bahrain. Such a device is for the moment unique within the culture of Tylos, and has never been seen in any of the contemporary necropolises of the island. Insofar, the anthropological study of our colleague revealed that the presence of an adult female, so we cannot exclude the desire to symbolically mark the female gender of this burial. It was a current practice in other Tylos necropolis, for example, placing spindle of spindle whorled in bone in the female graves, marking a kind of weaving full activity, probably most associated with the ladies at that time. Another interpretation might see this practice here in this grave 39 as a simple reminder of the deceased professional activity. Maybe she was a weaver or in charge of a weaver company or what else, we don't know. This grave was very interesting For example, we discovered that there was a single individual found in this grave, exactly between the knees of the lady who was lying there. It could be here still a stillborn child, but much more probably a fairly classical phenomenon in funerary archaeology. The deceased in that case could have been pregnant at that time. And in that case, the body could have expelled the fetus at the time of the decomposition of the body. It's a quite classical case which has been observed in a lot of necropolis in the world. We found also, to a nice gold bracelet, we found also remains of two perforated bone plaques bearing an engraved decoration where one can identify two figures whose arrangement of the hair could suggest in one of the cases a female character. This finding is, by the way, particularly interesting chronologically because plaques with similar decoration come from other funerary contexts from the Arabian Peninsula dating from the end of the 1st century BC and the beginning of the first AD and CE. The most complete parallels are found notably at Ed-Dur, a site I mentioned, but also in the Emirates, in Asima, in Melea, in Dibba, and other similar objects were reported from Yemen. So, another example of a strange grave. This grave is something, this grave, we are very happy when we find it because as you see at the top left image, it was a complete intact burial place, perfectly sealed, and we opened it. It was not filled with sediment, and there was a female individual inside. A skeleton was in perfect connection. It was probably placed in a wooden coffin. There is a lot of dark wooden fragment remains that you can see at the top of the bones. But very strangely, this burial was not accompanied by a single burial offering, which is quite strange for a tomb which has been not plundered, not looted. The careful examination, the situation, seems surprising, to say the least, given the context of this necropolis, quite rich, and which provided, as you have seen, many clues of high social status. However, the anthropological analysis showed that this was a relatively old woman, which has been buried there, suffering from a bone pathology induced by some heavy physical activity, visibly over a long period. And if I quote my bioanthropologist, Berenice Chamel, she said that this activity was involving the kneeling or squatting position most of the time. So we can't exclude the hypothesis of a possible servant whom master or employers would have welcomed upon her death in their own necropolis, but strangely, without granting her with the slightest funeral offering, or almost, even not a single little obol in his mouth, which is quite sad. By the way, you can see this terrible mark of arthrosis on the knee of this old lady, which was probably suffering the maximum at that time. A few last examples. Even if the graves are looted, it's very interesting sometimes to observe them very carefully. And for that, the eye of a bioanthropologist is sometimes even better than the eye of an archaeologist. For example, our bioanthropologist was able the archaeologist was able, for example, to observe that there was a very teeny hole for entering in this graves, a very teeny hole. We have noticed that, but our anthropologist noticed that the knee of the skeleton has been completely scratched by somebody who put his foot in antiquity on the bones. At the time, it was already bone. But this mark is just less than 15 centimeters long, about 13 centimeters long. So it's definitely the foot of a child. And very probably the looters have sent a child inside this teeny entrance of the grave in order to recover the material of his grave, which was found completely empty. Another example, the nearly last one, this was a very small grave. We're very surprised when we find it by the small size, completely sealed, apparently intact. And when we open it, we find inside something quite exceptional. It was the very well preserved body of a child. I can't remember the age of this child, but it was less than 1 year, or maybe 1 year old. And usually at this time, children of this age were never buried in a grave, in a big grave. They were put in burial jars. We found 4 burial jars at the site with remains of fetus or very small children. So we have to imagine that it was here the daughter. We are not sure because at this age it's very difficult to provide a determination, male or female, to a skeleton. To this small child, it was a child of somebody important who have preferred to bury it in a real grave. We found material in his grave, by the way. We find a little vessel, and we found a very nice gold earring with 2 pearls still in situ. It was what I was suggesting, that it could have been a little girl. And even we found, due to the precision of our bioanthropologist excavation, fragment of cloth, of tissue, woven tissue, very small. Is it a remains of a shroud? Is it the remain of a bag where small objects were placed? Is it the remain of a garment? We don't know. We don't know. But it's quite exceptional to find remains of tissue in the antiquity of Bahrain. This is, I think, my last example I want to present you, because this one is quite interesting. As you can see, when we open this grave, we realize that it was a completely disturbed grave, looted, perturbated, and we were very, very, very sad when we opened it. So there was a lot of perturbated bone, but we discovered that this deeply disturbed grave, inside its filling, we find in a very unexpected way 5 circular thin plates in gold worked in repoussé. And that it's quite interesting. You have them here, find almost folded when we find them, and when we were able to treat them and draw them, this is this. We find 5, but only 4. We can see that they represent a portrait of a woman seen in profile with abundant hair arranged in a thick braid at the back, and she wears several necklaces or ornament along her neck. The upper part of a garment with an apparently open neckline is also clearly visible. This repoussé decoration seems rather finely crafted, and despite the condition of these extremely thin pieces, we were able to recover them from this mixing of bones and sediment, which was not a very easy task. Alors, what is really interesting about this objects, that previously in this kind of object that we interpret as thin plate intended to be attached to the garment, for example, or maybe to the shroud, this type of object is known from Shakura. It's known from Abu Saiba at first. The 2 upper ones, with a burden man and an eagle, was found with 2 other similar pieces, 4 pieces in total, presently displayed in Bahrain National Museum, were found in Abu Saiba on the same site in 1983. But what is interesting that in the very neighboring necropolis of Shakura, situated a few hundred meters, they found other ones, and notably one with exactly the same, almost same portrait as the one we found in our grave in Abu Saiba. Now, could they have been produced by the same workshop? It could be an hypothesis, but another hypothesis cannot be ruled out given the proximity of style of this object. To get such an hypothesis could be the one being produced by the same factory. So I will conclude now my talk just by these few words. We have an enigma at this site. When we excavate at Abu Saiba, very often we found a lot of Dilmun pottery between the graves. Fragments, more or less complete vessel, which is strange. Pottery, which is about 2,000 older than our graves. What are they doing there? We even find the Dilmun seal of the first generation, an early Dilmun type of seal, a very fine one, as you see here. We have absolutely no explanation at the moment. One of the possibilities could be that, as it has been demonstrated in some 2 or 3 other places in Bahrain, this Tylos cemetery, situated at the north of Bahrain, could have been settled on early Dilmun cemetery from the end of the period. And it was the case in Abu Saiba, not far from our cemetery, on an excavation made many years ago by another French colleague. And we have made, of course, sorry, I have the same problem. We have tried to make a deep sounding, but for the moment we reached the bedrock and we were not able to go beyond. So it will be a project to continue that and try to go beyond to demonstrate if there is something older than this. So in a word of conclusion, it will be very short because I have overpassed the time instead of all this technical problem. We have a project to complete the wood excavation of this cemetery. We have now chosen a new strategy of works, which will allow us to save time, notably by removing the top of the hill with some mechanical means, which will hurry up the time of excavation and concentrate our force on the excavation of the graves themselves. So we hope to have several more seasons at this site, and very probably you will have opportunity, if you're interested, to visit us in the coming years at this site. So I wish to thank, of course, my very efficient team all over this season. Thanks also to our team of very hard laborers, mostly coming from Bangladesh. And of course, I thank you very much for your attention. Providing again all my apologies for all these technical problems. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Pierre, for that lovely presentation. I think because we've gone over time, we should really only allow time for one question, if there is one. Should also show my face. Yes, does anybody have any questions? I think we've got time for one before we go. And if not, then I would like to thank you all very much for your patience. Did someone say something? No. I'd like to thank you all very much for your patience and for attending. And thank you very much to Dr. Pierre. And we will hopefully see you all next week. think someone's trying to say something, but it's not coming through clearly.
It will be you next week.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll meet again Wednesday next week at the same time. Okay, goodbye, everybody. Thank you.